name is Melinda Hinkson. I'm an anthropologist at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization at Deakin University. And I'm also director of the Independent Institute of Postcolonial Studies here in Melbourne. We're very pleased to be co-hosting these meetings over the next week. As we come together, let me acknowledge the Aboriginal countries from which we are all zooming in and speaking from today. Here in Melbourne, I acknowledge the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people, and more widely, the owners, custodians, leaders, and activists who are shouldering the burden of caring for their country at such a difficult time, this time of pandemic lockdowns, as well as catastrophic climate change. I extend a warm greeting to all Indigenous people joining us today. As you know, our gathering this morning extends all the way to Canada, and while welcoming our keynote speaker, Jeff Corntassel, I also acknowledge the country of the Cherokee Nation. I'm going to pass over to Vanessa Borolski now to introduce Jeff and the larger series of discussions. And as I do so, I thank Vanessa for her vision, her determination, and hard work over the last several months in designing and organising these meetings. Thanks also to Giles Campbell-Wright and Jenny Banks at ADI and Carlos Moreo, Executive Officer of IPCS, who are providing essential technological assistance over coming days. Now, please note that these meetings are being recorded and they'll shortly appear on both the ADI and IPCS websites. Over to you, Vanessa.
Thanks, Melinda, and welcome to everybody. I've been very pleased by the reception and the number of people who've registered for these seminars, because I think it's a really important discussion. As most of you will know, the 2017 Uluru Statement that was released after the consultation by the Referendum Council on meaningful recognition for Indigenous Australians called for voice, treaty and truth. Although aspects of the Uluru Statement remain contested, I think the desire for some form of truth-telling was widely articulated at the dialogues and has been expressed by a number of Indigenous Australians. However, so far there's been very little discussion about the nature of the truth-telling that Indigenous and indeed non-Indigenous Australians envisage. So this seminar series really is a very preliminary attempt to begin to grapple with this challenge. And we see it very much as about an opening up of a conversation. And we warmly invite you to participate and share your insights, experiences, and ideas. Thus far, the debate about truth-telling and transitional justice in settler colonial societies, and indeed globally, has largely been framed in terms of the notions of reconciliation and recognition. In Australia, reconciliation and recognition processes that have taken place have not succeeded in meaningfully recognising the colonial violence on which the country was founded, nor has it acknowledged Indigenous political agency or the need for structural change. I think the government's response to the call for a voice in the Uluru Statement is very much indicative of that problem. So the seminar series is an attempt to relocate the discussion about truth-telling within a conversation about decolonisation in the settler colonial state, and a discussion about how or if it can contribute to that aspiration. I would argue that this conversation about decolonisation is actually a precondition for meaningful recognition and reconciliation. An equally important objective of the seminar series is to reframe truth-telling and the acknowledgement of colonial violence as the equal responsibility of all members of the Australian community, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, working as a collective partnership. So we'll be joined by some wonderful speakers over the next 4 sessions who've engaged creatively with, sorry, I've got a puppy who's busy chewing my desk, who have engaged with creatively in some of the complexities of colonial violence and dispossession in Australia. So today we're going to be joined, and we're honoured to be joined by our first speaker, Jeff Corntassel, who's speaking all the way from Canada. Jeff Corntassel is a writer, teacher and father from the Cherokee Nation. He's currently Associate Professor in the Indigenous Studies Department at the University of Victoria and Acting Director of the Centre for Indigenous Research and Community-Led Engagement. His research and teaching focus on everyday acts of resurgence and the intersections between Indigenous resurgence, climate change, gender, and community well-being. He's currently completing work for his forthcoming book on sustainable self-determination, which examines Indigenous climate justice, food security, and gender-based resurgence. So no doubt Jeff's presentation will help us think through some of the complexities of truth-telling as he shares his reflections on the truth and reconciliation process in Canada and the role of storytelling as an avenue for decolonization. So Jeff will speak for about 40 minutes, and then this will be followed by 20 minutes of a discussion. Just a reminder to keep your microphones on mute unless you're speaking. If you would like to ask Jeff a question, you're welcome to post it in the chat, or unfortunately the virtual hand function apparently is not working, so you'll have to just raise your thumb and we'll do our best to get to you, to unmute you so you can ask a question. Over to you, Jeff.
Wado. Thank you to Vanessa and to Melinda for inviting me to be a part of this important speaker series. So I'll just introduce myself briefly in Cherokee, and then we'll start the slides and our discussion together. Osio Nigada, Shalagia Yetli Egoina Sa'i, Jeff Ganaholido, Corntassel Dagwadoa, Echoda Galski Go'i. So my name is Jeff Corntassel. My Cherokee name is Ganaholido, which means hunter. These days it's been more of a hunter of knowledge since I haven't been really out in the bush doing much hunting these days. But it's good to be with you all. I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the territory of Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples, and whose lands and waters basically shape their political thought, governance, and self-determining authority that should inform how we relate to these places. And I also speak to you on behalf of my family. My family is, my partner is from Secunderabad, India, and I have 3 teenage kids that are in the house. So if you do hear any ruckus, that's what's happening. And so I'll start the screen sharing here, and then we'll get this going. All right. So yeah, it's an honor to be speaking to you all. You know, these are some pictures of my family, and whenever I give a talk like this, I always think about the ways in which we relate to each other and the ways in which we're accountable for our words. And I think there's a lot to be said about the ways that truth-telling impacts our relations and how we're accountable not only to our relatives, but we're accountable to the land, we're accountable to the water, we're accountable to all of those relationships that form our healthy well-being, and the ways that we conduct ourselves. So we've had a lot of social distancing guidelines, and I put these up just as kind of a humorous way to show that ways in which we've expressed the need for guidelines amidst this pandemic. And how Indigenous peoples have gotten innovative in expressing these things. So 6 feet, meaning 3 spring salmon apart, right? And then also you see the width of a old growth cedar tree as being acceptable social distance. Coming to you from the West Coast of Canada, in Victoria, British Columbia. And, you know, it's also on a more serious note, a lot of Indigenous nations have closed down their borders to their territories, to their waterways, as a way to protect the citizens of their nations. And so that has been met by challenges on a bunch of different levels, from fishermen and from other hotels and restaurants And so that struggle for self-determination, that struggle to assert your self-determining authority, that is very real out here, and it's important to note that. I wanted to start by sharing a brief version of how medicine came to the people, because it informs a lot of my discussion around decolonizing our thought process, and also around truth-telling. And so this is some of my tobacco that I grew during this pandemic, over the summer, and then also strawberries. But there was a time when Cherokees were taking deer, and they weren't honoring the deer that they were killing. And so they had forgotten their age-old treaty, their age-old agreement to honor the lives of those animals that had fallen and to honor their families. And so the deer noticed this, and they held a council. And they held a council, and they discussed how disrespectful the Cherokees were being. They discussed how we were acting in haste, and we weren't being very thoughtful in terms of the ways that we were killing deer, and we're killing too many deer. And so they said, how can we kind of teach them a lesson? And so the bear that was at this council said, well, I found a bow and arrow, and maybe we can use that against them. And so, the bear was imagine a bear trying to pull back on a boa, and couldn't quite do it because of his long claws. So he said, well, if I trim my claws, maybe I can shoot this bow. And immediately the animal said, well, we can't do that, because then, that's actually compromising who you are. That's changing who you are. And so the deer spoke up and said, you know what? We'll give them disease. And so they said, we'll give Cherokees rheumatoid arthritis and other diseases, and they'll suffer, and they'll see what's going on, and they'll understand that they caused this. So the Cherokees were hurting a great deal. And the plant nations began to look upon them with sorrow. They saw how Cherokees were suffering. And so they looked at the people, and they said, how can we help them? So the plants held their own council, and they said, you know what? We can give them medicines. We can give our own bodies to give them medicines, and we can help heal them. We can help bring them back from this terrible state. And so that's how medicine came to the people. And there's a lot of different aspects of this story. And I think one of the most important is consent, right? And protocols, following those age-old protocols. And there's even a lesson about how we change ourselves to adapt to colonization, when in fact the opposite needs to be true, right? We need to assert who we are rather than change ourselves. So I'm thinking of the part with the bear in it. So there's lots of different lessons. And when you think about how medicine came to the people, it came because we forgot our original vision. We forgot that story that we're supposed to share with succeeding generations around how we treat deer, about how we honor those animals and those relations. And so I think this has a lot of lessons for us just about remembering. And it really ties nicely into what Sarah Hunt has called a witnessing methodology, where we need stories, we need those methods to witness and understand how these injustices are occurring. So you can think of the plants as playing this role. They're witnessing what's going on, and then they say, we need to step in. There's something that's happening here that's not right. And so when you think about witnessing as a methodology, it's very important in our communities, right? To come together, to make these observations, and then to step up and engage in behavior that's going to help change the situation, right? To promote the health and well-being of Indigenous peoples. I think the other part of this story really shows how the land and our bodies are intertwined. And this is a nice piece by Aaron Consmo from Métis Nation. that shows that our bodies are not terra nullius. That is, what happens to the land also happens to our bodies, and vice versa, right? And so we've seen in a lot of cases where Indigenous land defenders have been criminalized, they've been arrested, also that the government of Canada can engage in state building and can engage in these exercises to expand their jurisdiction. And when we know that responsibility to protect the land, that responsibility to honor those relationships, those come from those deep senses of memory. Those come from our self-determining authority. So I'm going to give you only a brief overview of residential schools, because there's just no way to do that justice in the short amount of time that we have here today. But this is a picture by Norval Morrisseau that shows how children were impacted and how families were impacted by residential schools. And of course, residential schools were designed to take children out of their communities and place them in schools that were usually far away from not only their families, but from their communities, from their lands, in order to change them, right? In order to basically assimilate them into Canadian culture. And so to strip them of their language, to strip them of literally their hair, to strip them of their heritage ultimately. And so this happened on a widespread scale starting in 1884, and it was run by churches and also with the government of Canada. And it didn't end until 1996, when the last two residential schools were closed. And at that point, over 120,000 kids had attended these residential schools over those years. 120,000. And these were also places where kids died, right? They died of things like exposure. They died of things like suicide, right? These residential schools had grave sites, right? What kind of school has a grave site, you ask, right? These are places where kids went to die. That's where their spirit was impacted to such a point where they were ravaged. And so, during this time period, there was mobilization by survivors. And I do want to say I'm not speaking on behalf of any survivors, because I'm an intergenerational survivor of boarding school in the States, but that's a different system. So I do want to say that I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone or any experience, but suffice it to say, these experiences were devastating. And they had such an impact that they broke up several Indigenous families. They broke up those connections to land and place. So we had our Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was formed in 2008. It was the first TRC that was formed to focus on Indigenous children. And it was formed as a result of a class action suit that was filed by survivors in 2006. And part of the agreement was that there would be an apology, there would be a 5-year basically investigation into residential schools, there would be a common experience payout, as well as an IEP process, which is independent assessment process for more severe cases of trauma, right? And so those 4 things came together and started in 2008 and really getting going in 2009 with 3 justices that you see pictured here. And so they took testimony, from over 15,000 different people. And I think the thing to note is that this was survivor focused, right? So it was focused on the survivors and their testimony, but it did not allow for perpetrators to be named. And that was part of the controversy of this TRC. And so perpetrators weren't named, except in a few of the instances that I saw where survivors basically said, I want to name this person or these people that committed these heinous acts. And so they were named in these momentary acts of, I'd say, Decolonizing Truth telling, right? Where they actually named them in front of this audience, and so that these people could be held to account. However, the focus was on that common experience payout, which you had to demonstrate that you had gone to particular schools during a certain period of time. And it was $10,000 for the first year that you went to the school and $3,000 for each year afterwards. Rather arbitrary figure, which also came into controversy because how do you put a price on the years that you've gone to residential school, that you've been taken away from your family? And so there's also the discussion around what do you do with that check when you get it? So there are a lot of suicides, and there are a lot of forms of, I'd say, violence around these common experience payouts that in a sense re-traumatized families, that re-traumatized some of the survivors that were receiving this money. So we can go into that later, but I think in 2015, the TRC wrapped up its 5-year mission, and they issued not only a full report, but also a series of 94 calls to action. And these 94 calls to action, this is 5 years ago that they were issued. Of those calls to action, only about 15% of those have been, or 15 have been acted on, right, in any tangible way. So we can get to kind of the accountability mechanisms and the, in a sense, the need for not only more openness around these calls to action, but also to how do you put them into place? How do you implement them? Well, there are a couple of critiques around reconciliation that I wanted to share with you. One is from the late Art Manual from Secwepemc Nation. And one of the overriding critiques is that you can't have reconciliation without talking about land, right? You can't actually separate these actions of taking these kids away from their communities, away from their families, without addressing the land question. Here in British Columbia, basically, most of the land is unceded. That's why I mentioned that in the acknowledgement. So it's unceded, that is, there has been no treaty to transfer that land. In fact, it's Indigenous land, right? And so Art and several other people like Leanne Simpson and others have talked about how you can't have true or meaningful reconciliation until we have, I would say, a truthful conversation around stolen land and around how land has been encroached on, not just the land, but the water has been encroached on. And we need to address that prior to a real meaningful discussion around reconciliation. The other aspect of this is because the TRC focused so much on children, you would think that that would be the first priority for addressing any meaningful change, right? In fact, Cindy Blackstock talks about reconciliation, and her definition is means not having to say you're sorry twice. So what does that actually mean? It means the first time you say you're sorry, it's accompanied with tangible action to address the harm that was done. And so despite Prime Minister Harper's apology, we see, based on Cindy Blackstock's work, Cindy's from Gixan, her research has shown that there are more kids in that have been taken from their homes and put into childcare. It's at a rate 2 to 3 times higher than at the height of residential school. That is, this problem still persists. It simply took one agency and transferred those genocidal, I would argue, actions to a different agency, in this case, Ministry of Child and Family Development, and some of those adjoining agencies. So we see that rather than say you're sorry once, right, we see multiple apologies around the continued impacts, the negative impacts on Indigenous children. And so this hasn't been addressed in any meaningful way that is stopping this violence and stopping the breakup of Indigenous families. So this leads me to think about, and especially as we're talking about decolonizing truths, and I think of decolonization itself as a process, right? A process that is accompanied by particular events. So events that raise your consciousness, events that really set you on a path towards deepening an understanding of the need to dismantle these oppressive organizations, these oppressive institutions. But even more fundamentally, the need to get your land back, right? So you can't have meaningful reconciliation, in my view, and especially meaningful decolonization without addressing land, without addressing the root of Indigenous kind of activism and the root of Indigenous relationships. So I see 4 dead ends in the reconciliation discourse as it's played out in Canada. And I think I won't go into too much detail, but the first is pursuit of reconciliation as political and economic certainty. That is this desire to set up framework agreements. In some cases, they were called reconciliation agreements. In other cases, they were called new treaties. So there's a BC treaty process. And this idea that we will settle the land question once and for all. However, in the BC treaty process, it actually took much of the land off the table in terms of being able to get your land back. It also, for Indigenous nations, it also extinguished original title to the land. So this effort to pursue economic and political certainty is really for the benefit of other foreign direct investors, right? So that they can actually invest in the land. It's not for Indigenous nations themselves. The other part of this is reconciliation is returning to a mythical previous condition, this romanticized notion that we were all getting along and then something happened, which often is a false narrative. It's often a myth, right? And so understanding that when we're talking about reconciliation, it actually means a rethinking of those relationships. It's not just a renewal, it's a rethinking of those relationships that led to such harm. The third, pursuit of reconciliation is a historical reboot, and you see it in the TRC language of needing to turn the page in history, right? This idea of putting history behind us and moving forward. There's always that language. It's almost the language of forgive and forget. And certainly a lot of the public opinion polls have reflected this, where people want to forget, they want to put this behind them. And yet we know as Indigenous peoples, we have long memories, and Cherokees even have a phrase, learn to live in a longer now, learn your history and your culture and understand that that's part of who you are now. We have to understand that these aspects of history are part of who we are now. And so we can't put them aside, or we can't ignore them unless we do so at our own peril. And then finally, the pursuit of reconciliation is risk management. This idea that it's simply a stopgap measure, right? Just to hold off on other future land claims, to hold off on future activism. It's a way to mitigate it versus actually resolve the deeper questions around land, about the dissolution of families and the need to promote community. As kind of an alternative to the way the reconciliation discourse is played out with the TRC, we have the witness blanket, and I bring this out as an example. This is Carrie Newman, who's Kwakwakwiak and Stalo, and he's an artist, and he's in 2012, he had this vision of getting materials from former residential schools and weaving them together into a blanket. Some of these materials were, as you see behind him, were pieces of glass, there were doorknobs, there were shoes, all these different items, ice skates, all these different items that communities sent him. In fact, he said he was overwhelmed at one point because over 800 items were sent to him from 77 different First Nations, right? And so what do you do with all those things? So he wove those into this beautiful blanket, which tells the story of these survivors. And since we're talking about how the stories shape us, one of the items that he got was especially troubling. He received a shoe from a residential school, and the people that were holding it said they were having bad dreams. And so they gave him the shoe. And Carey realized at that point that he needed to do something different. He needed to take a different approach and treat the shoe as a living being. And so he brought the shoe into his home, and he began talking to it. He began explaining what he was trying to do. And he felt a different sense of, I guess, a different sense of ease from that entity, right? And so this work profoundly shaped him. And these stories of these survivors are woven into this blanket. And so this is how stories shape us, right? This is a living example of how these stories are shaping who we are, but also shaping how we understand and have come to understand the ravages of residential school and also the resilience of Indigenous peoples. But the witness blanket's journey is still continuing, right? It's not just being shown at different places around the country. The Canadian Museum of Human Rights wanted to have access to the witness blanket so that they could put it on permanent display. And so my daughter and I went to this ceremony where at Comox First Nation, where there was meant to be a handover of the witness blanket to the Canadian Human Rights Museum. Now you might say, okay, this seems like a very straightforward thing. Well, what Carey did is he actually wrote a contract from the perspective of the witness blanket. So the witness blanket itself had agency to decide how it needed to be taken care of. And so rather than owning the witness blanket or bringing it in as a possession, it is about how to take care of the witness blanket to honor that contract. And so it's a very unique contract, that agreement concerning the stewardship of the witness blanket. And so that ceremony was witnessed by us, again, witnessing this truth telling in action, right? Witnessing this compact, in a sense, between the witness blanket and the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, as well as Carey and his family. I think along those lines, the late Shan Goshorn, who's from Eastern Cherokee, she's passed on, unfortunately. She also wrote truth into her artwork. And I think artists really inspire, I think, a lot of us when we think about truth telling and decolonizing these forms of communication. So she created, she titled this particular set of baskets, Resisting the Mission, Filling the Silence. But she called her baskets in general protest baskets. And what she did, rather than weave these out of materials that we might usually use, like oak, split oak, or honeysuckle, or other materials, she took splints of paper, in this case with the names of all the children who attended boarding schools in the US, and wove those into a basket. And it's not just any basket, it's a double weave basket, which takes a particular talent, right, to weave a basket inside of a basket simultaneously. Anyway, I think these, and she's done this with a lot of her work, these names and these baskets give testimony to the impacts and the experiences of Indigenous peoples. And it's another form of truth telling in asserting these experiences as being important to bring our attention to. Elsewhere in BC, up in northern BC, there's been a lot going on with Wet'suwet'en First Nation around free, prior, and informed consent, and their battles to protect their territories. And so this is a picture of the Unistoten Healing Center, and it's when I went there. And I bring this example up for a number of reasons, but one of them is this protocol that they practice in order for you to cross the bridge, in order for you to cross into their territory. And I think of this with all of our work that we do, especially on Indigenous lands, the Indigenous lands of Australia, the Indigenous lands of Canada, the Indigenous lands and waters of Turtle Island, right? And so what would happen is you could see the sign, honk and wait. So we honked and waited, and a representative from Wet'suwet'en in this case it was Frida Houston, who ran the Healing Center, came across the bridge and asked us several questions. One is, what was your name? And do you work for government or industry? What's your intention? And then the last question that was the most challenging was one I urge you to think about, and especially in consideration of the indigenous nations that you work with or that you whose lands you're on. She said, how will your time here benefit the land and the community? So again, giving the land and community agency and talking about how will your specific talents, how will your visit here actually benefit us? And those are difficult questions to answer. And so, as an educator, I came up with something around education. We were with some Wet'suwet'en youth, so we're able to answer that in terms of them reclaiming their heritage and their culture. But that's a difficult question to answer. And so those kinds of questions, and also this story, this really new story that I'm sharing with you, help us to better understand the ways that we can engage in questions of free, prior, and informed consent. Well, the story doesn't end there, unfortunately. The Unistoten camp, as well as the Gidimt'en checkpoint, were in direct line of several pipelines that were proposed to cut across Wet'suwet'en territory. So in this case, the Coastal GasLink company wanted to put a natural gas pipeline across the territory. And so despite the refusal of Gidimt'en as well as Unistoten, Coastal GasLink invoked the RCMP and even members of the armed forces for a violent raid in early 2019, in which 14 people were arrested. And again, where is the free, prior, and informed consent, right? And so these are the new forms of truth tellers in the sense that they are standing up for their land as land defenders, but they're also documenting this violation of the very laws that Canada and other countries claim to be adhering to. And so here you see pictures from that day at Gidimt'en. And of course, it didn't end there. And the reason I put this picture up is this is Unistoten in February of 2020, and it has reconciliation across the bridge. So that's that very same checkpoint that you saw earlier. And so in order to go onto Unistoten territory, the RCMP had to actually cut through the reconciliation sign, which is very symbolic, right? And it's again shows the innovation of indigenous nations of showing these new kind of pictorial representations of colonization. And so these red dresses represent murdered and missing indigenous women and girls. And so these officers, in this case, 30 police cars, were called to Unistoten after Unistoten had evicted Coastal GasLink from their territory. And they arrested 6 indigenous women who were doing ceremony. And so Frida Houston was one of those women. And so as she was doing ceremony, she was arrested. And of course, this is a quote from her, but again, getting at that link between land and bodies. So one of the mistakes, or one of the, maybe not a mistake as much as one of the calculated decisions of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was to separate land from the question of the impacts on the children. And of course, you can't do everything in one 5-year period, but we also have to convey that the land is not separate from us. What happens on the land happens to us. And a little bit closer to where you all are, when you think of the rights of nature and how the personhood that's being granted to rivers in places like the Whanganui River in New Zealand or Aotearoa, we think of different ways that personhood is being applied in Turtle Island to different rivers and lands. These are new forms of thinking about how violence is occurring on the land, but these are also new forms of thinking about protections to the land and to the waters that we live on. During this raid on, the second raid on Unistaten, UNDRIP had been passed, of course, in 2007, and it was passed with a vote against it from Canada, vote against it from the US, Australia, and New Zealand. Well, Canada came back in 2016 and said that they will remove their permanent objector status to UNDRIP, the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Also took it a step further in British Columbia and became one of the few places in the world where we put UNDRIP into legislation in 2019. So that's the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, DRIPA. These are terrible acronyms, by the way, that was put in place in 2019. DRIPA, or UNDRIP, was also featured prominently in the calls to action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so those calls to action were actually accompanied with this need to put UNDRIP into more tangible legislation. So British Columbia actually did that in 2019, and yet it made no difference, it made no impact on the events at Wet'suwet'en and the events on other Indigenous territories as it was implemented, causing a lot of people, especially Indigenous youth, to say that reconciliation is dead. And so you see the signs of reconciliation is dead at rallies. You see them at different events, and with this understanding or this perception that reconciliation has not led to anything meaningful. It has not led to us not saying you're sorry twice. It has not led to us to anticipate a shared future together in any meaningful way. I also think of new forms of truth-telling, new forms of solidarity in places like Mauna Kea on the Big Island of Hawaii, where they're protecting their sacred mountain, Mauna Kea, from encroachment by a 30-meter telescope that's been proposed. And so as people encamp there to protect the land and to protect that telescope from being built, which would be about an 18-story telescope on the top of this highest peak of Mauna Kea. Also saw signs of the ways that we come together as Indigenous nations. So you can see the Cherokee Nation flag that's already flying there, but you also see the Maori flag. You see flags from other Indigenous nations and even other states. And so it shows that we are coming together. We are showing new forms of solidarity in these places. Another aspect of truth-telling happened in May of 2013 here on the island. It was an event where we reclaimed a place name. And so the name that was given was Mount Douglas. It's named after the first governor of BC. And Indigenous peoples have always had a different name for that place. And so despite putting signs up saying Pecals, over the previous decades, those signs were always taken down or discarded. We went in force with about 500 people, led by Wasanich and Lekwungen people, and we put a new sign up. And the sign basically says Pecals, and it gives a little bit of the history. It's another way of implanting those truths back onto the map. And we did it without permission from the local authorities. And it's still standing today in 2020 as a sign just to demonstrate the resilience of Indigenous peoples, but also to demonstrate the true and actual name of that place. The other part of this that wasn't spoken about as much in the media is that when you got to the top of this mountain, there was a reenactment of the signing of the Douglas Treaty. And so this reenactment actually was the story and putting that new story back onto the landscape. So those 500 people were witnesses to this new story, and they now carried that story with them to tell their their family members to tell other people what is the real history behind this place. And I think a lot of our visions for, if we want to call it reconciliation, a lot of our visions for relationality are in our treaties. And so there's a new treaty signed, well, it's not so new anymore, but in 2014, the Bison or Buffalo Treaty, signed by Blackfeet nations, some 18 Blackfeet nations, both on the US and Canadian side of the border. And this treaty was really designed for one basic thing: to honor and respect the buffalo and their relationship to that buffalo. And so every year they have a renewal to renew that commitment to protecting that buffalo or that bison. And this is a vision, right? This is a vision being put into action. This is truth telling, but it's also a way of strengthening our commitments to our relational responsibilities through collective action. And that's Leroy Little Bear on the right, who's one of the architects of that treaty. And then we have news stories, and I'll just close here. We have news stories that happen in everyday ways that reflect our current truths. So this is my daughter. This is a few years back, but we're in the middle of Oklahoma, and we decided to stop and help a snapping turtle across the road. The snapping turtle was not that pleased with our intervention. And this is the correct way, by the way, to hold a snapping turtle, from the back. So my daughter was insistent, that we help this snapping turtle. And so we helped it across the road. It quickly went into the water, and it seems like a very simple story, right? But at a much deeper level, that turtle represents a lot for Cherokees. Doxy. That doxy represents our link to other worlds. So oftentimes Cherokees will say, we come from a world 4 worlds back, right? It's that turtle that can go through the land and the water and brings us to these different worlds. That turtle is also what we use, that turtle shell is what we use in our dances. So Leela currently has tin cans, but normally women would wear turtle shells around their ankles during our stomp dances. And so this relationship is there, and it was rekindled with this simple act, this simple everyday act. And these are actions that are often unacknowledged or unseen, but they're significant, and that we experience them in profound ways that teach us about our relational responsibilities. So I'll close there and open it up for questions. Wado.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was really wonderful and fascinating. Just while people are maybe thinking of some questions, I think what's really interesting is that you're presenting truth-telling as a kind of complex, dispersed, localized form of engagement with the past and the future, as opposed to the traditional model of a big national commission, where you have an adjudication basically of people's truths. Here it seems to be a much more kind of emergent and creative approach. So I wondered whether you could just comment on that in terms of a process for Australia. What are the implications if we're thinking about truth-telling in the Australian context?
Yeah, I think, I think it's interesting too, Australia's thinking about treaty, right? And developing new treaties or first treaties with Indigenous peoples of the place. And I think treaties are an important moment where you sit down and you actually envision what that relationship would look like and has looked like, and you set out some guidelines for what those responsibilities are that you'd share. And so I think actually treaty is one of many ways that we can get at these deeper senses of responsibility and these deeper senses of truth. Of course, you have to have trust in these settings, and you have to have a willingness to engage fully. That is, time is always a factor. So I think just as an example, Cherokee word for peace is tohi. And tohi means peaceful relations, but it also means being on a different time frame. we're working at the pace of nature. So being at the pace of nature means you slow down. It also means that you are more fluid, you're more dynamic. When we rush things, just like that, how medicine came to the people story, when we rush things, that's where we get illness. That's where we start to become more rigid. And so being on the Aboriginal time frame of events versus the state of Australia time frame would need to happen in order for that to be an effective mechanism, would be my sense. So treaty, of course, is just one of many ways, but I think truth telling has to precede these events. That is, you can't, and so we're still in the truth telling stage, I'd say, in Canada and in a lot of different settings, you know, before you can get to deeper questions of what does reconciliation look like.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'll just read a question from the chat. Do you think the settler state will ever behave in a way that means they will no longer have to say sorry once, twice, thrice, and so on? Do you have any optimism about that, either in the Canadian or the Australian context?
I think I must be optimistic because I'm still a teacher, so I still think I have some sort of optimism around that. I think the settler state is premised on short memories. It's based on short-term memory and amnesia, collective amnesia. And so I think of, you know, there's ignorance and then there's willful ignorance. And oftentimes I see that ignorance itself can be addressed by simply being made aware. You know, did you know this happened? Did you know that these things are happening? Versus willful ignorance, I don't have much time for, and I don't think any of us have much time for, because how do you address people that don't want to hear your truths? How do you address people that don't, or that refuse to listen? And so I think I must be somewhat optimistic, but I don't see it changing anytime soon. I think, you know, the recent events of whether it's George Floyd, whether it's Chantel Moore in Canada, you know, show that we still have a long ways to go in terms of addressing some of these deeper systemic forms of racism, but also addressing the sheer willful ignorance of some people that are refusing to acknowledge not only that Indigenous peoples are part of this place, but refusing to acknowledge the truths of our experiences, whether it's around residential schools or whether it's around day-to-day acts that people are encountering that are harmful. So the answer is somewhat. I think I'm somewhat optimistic, but I don't see it changing anytime soon. I think we're up for some major change, especially as we see solidarities now that are emerging that are really encouraging among Black and Indigenous peoples. We see solidarities, you know, that are emerging that are, you know, developing new treaties and new agreements, new visions, but we still have a long ways to go. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. The next question is about the blanket, the witness blanket. Sorry, this is all very, I'm just trying to read the chat and respond. Okay. So somebody's asking you about the strategic role of the symbolic moment of the witness blanket in the reconciliation process. The question is whether the symbolic moment is accompanied by fundamental changes in the way the state and society relates to Indigenous people, for example. I think that's in some ways coming back to the previous question, you know, the structural difficulties of actually enacting change. So I have to just see what if, yes, is this construction of such a monument universal in nature? Okay, it's quite a long question, but I suppose it's asking also about the kind of symbolic value of the witness blanket and the extent to which it actually impacted on relations in the Canadian context.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a big believer in what Megan Buller has called the pedagogy of discomfort. And so I actually believe when we go into uncomfortable situations, we gain a lot of deeper understanding, that we gain some perspective that we didn't otherwise know, especially when we interrogate, why am I uncomfortable in this setting? And so I think I love Carrie's vision for this, because it allows you to be uncomfortable in this place, as we should be with, I would call it genocide, attempted genocide, as we should be with this violence that occurred at the hands of the state and at the hands of the churches. But it also allows you to witness the impacts, right, on contemporary Indigenous people. So it's not just putting us in the past. And so I think it has a lot of interpersonal value. I think the people that have gone to see it have been impacted in profound ways. I don't think, if I understand the question correctly, I don't think it's had much of an impact on larger policy questions. I think it's been kind of confined to, I had this amazing experience. Boy, you know, Indigenous people sure had it difficult, right? And so what I'm hoping is that it translates into something different, into something actionable. But I don't have a way of assessing how the witness blanket per se has impacted change in kind of the daily lives of people that have witnessed it. So I think the answer is, I think the younger generation has probably been the most impacted. And this is what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a lot of the youth leadership, right, step up. And even with Wet'suwet'en, there was a huge Indigenous youth contingent, as well as people acting in solidarity at the legislature here with this effort to shut down Canada. And it was in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en. So I see that younger people are translating this into action maybe more frequently than some of the other folks that are visiting. But I think it's certainly a great tool to have and so we don't forget. I always think of, you know, so much of resurgence work is remembering. And so we need tools, we need things that help us remember, so that we don't destroy these records, so that we don't, which is what's going to happen in, I think it's in 2025 or something like that. A lot of the residential school testimonials will be destroyed, right? And so, you know, so that we don't forget these testimonies. And so we have living witnesses, but also we have living, in a sense, monuments to the truth telling that has gone on.
Thanks. Kevin, would you like to ask the question yourself? I think Carlos will unmute you.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Jeff. That was fascinating, and I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne as well. My question was that a lot of your stories seem to be about very creative responses, about connecting people, story, performance as forms of reflective practice, and that seemed in contrast to what you started with, the commission which seemed to be about talking and listening as a powerful tool, but there did seem to be a contrast to me. And I'm wondering whether you think that idea of connecting people to each other, stories and land, is a methodology for truth telling, and then how does that relate to engaging with the state?
That's a great question. I don't know if I'm going to do it justice, Kevin. I'll try though. I think what we need is about 1 million different Cheryl Bryces. So Cheryl Bryce is from Songhees Nation out here, and she started something about 15 years ago called a colonial reality tour. And so to get to your question, I think it is a methodology in the sense that if people don't understand how this impacts place and their situation on that place, then I think they're able to compartmentalize. They're able to, in a sense, shut it out of their everyday lives. And so what we did with Cheryl is we gave her a bullhorn, and we packed about 70 people up in a bus, and we went to different places like Beacon Hill Park, and she gave the place name Migan, place where you warm your belly in the sun. She gave the place name, and she spoke truth to power about the history of that place and the living history of that place. So Migan is still a place where she gathers camas or quetlal, which is a food staple of this area for Indigenous peoples. And this is where family has been gathering this for years. So I think in order to be effective, and especially since colonization does involve place, right? It involves land. It involves this whole notion of settler colonialism as being here to stay, right? It's a structure and event, right? But it involves land ultimately. In order for us to really be effective with truth telling, I think we have to find different ways to get people on the land so that they understand the impacts of their actions on not only subsequent generations, but on those places. So she also took us to the gorge, which is a place where a lot of people do kayaking and canoeing. And this is a story of literally of Camosun, right? And there's a figure of Camosun in that water. Well, the municipality blasted that figure because people couldn't get their kayaks through that narrow part of the river, right? And so she's telling us the destruction of this place and ultimately the destruction of that story. At the same time, we're witness to that, right? And she's telling us a story again. So I think you're right. If I've done any justice to your question, I think we have to have that multidimensional aspect in order to really be effective in conveying the impetus here for change, but also for truth telling. Yeah. Wado, thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. If people are okay to go on for a little bit longer, we've got a couple of questions. I know we've reached time, but I think it would be great to continue engaging with Jeff, if you don't mind, Jeff, just for another 10 minutes.
Sure,
okay,
absolutely.
Great. Naomi Wolf has a question. Carlos, if you could unmute Naomi.
Thank you. I'm a Troy Aboriginal woman. Thanks for your contributions, Jeff. It was merely a comment on settler societies, that I think the challenge is that there is a lot of cultural amnesia by those societies, and it's hard for people to acknowledge their own culture without being able to engage with other people's cultures. So it's interesting to see that in all of the settler societies across the world, there is similar responses with violence to truth-telling and, the processes of reconciliation commissions, whether it's in Canada or South Africa. It doesn't always end up in the best interests of Indigenous peoples. But thanks, Jeff. I enjoy your work, and we use it a lot here at ACU.
Thank you, Naomi. And I think you're totally right. I have a colleague, Heidi Stark, who's she's an Anishinaabe, and she always uses this question. I think it's a good one to ask is, all right, as a Cherokee, I know my origin story, and our origin story comes out of the Sky Arch, and it's this really long story. What is the origin story of the state? Yeah, tell us your origin story. And when you begin to tell that origin story, it doesn't sound so benign. It's very violent, right? It's about discovery, this doctrine of discovery. It's about violence, and it's about illegal occupation. So if we begin to ask people, just kind of, everyday citizens of whether it's Australia or Canada or the US or anywhere, what's the origin story as you understand it, and forcing them to, in a sense, account for this violence, and then understanding that they're not, they're part of that, but they're also, there's new stories to tell about how you can change those relationships. And so for a while, I'm going off on tangents now, but for a while I was really getting into different Indigenous words for settler. And so on the West Coast here, it's Wanitam, which means the hungry people. And so, and it's akin to a seagull that lands on your front doorstep and is always asking you for more food. And you know how seagulls are, they're very loud and very noisy. And that's how Indigenous people saw settlers in this area. And so my question to settlers, to people coming to this area is, how will you change that relationship so that they have to create a new word to describe your behavior, your actions? It might be equally repulsive, or it might be very positive in the sense of, it's a word for friendship, or it's a word for trusted one. But right now, Wanitum is how you're being seen, right? And you're seen as just ravaging the land, always asking for more. So how do we change that relationship so that a new word has to be created? So that's always my spark of hope, but it's also that challenge that we have for people in settler society.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff. There's just two more questions. Lorraine Towers, if you'd like to ask a question.
Hi, Jeff. Thank
Hey
you.
there.
I really enjoyed your talk. I'm interested in treaties for now and the future, and in thinking about that, how we look at treaties of the past. And maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of the treaties in North America had education, formal education, as part of the deal, if you like.
Yeah.
And yet that is really what what people got was the residential schools, if we collapse that. And so I'm wondering how we move forward into thinking, how can treaties be both structured, but also have the results that is really envisaged? How do we go about that? And it's that it just doesn't become a piece of paper, but also an instrument to actually oppress people as it has been in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So I'd say first off, you ask experts on treaties and not me. No, I think folks like Gina Starblanket, for example, if you Google her, she's doing some really important work on treaties, and especially in current interpretations of treaties. But my take on that is that the process is just as important as the outcome. So, we've so much are focused on the text of the treaty. And yet when we look at even the Douglas treaties out here, they were thought to be peace and friendship treaties. In fact, at the top of Pecals, when those chiefs signed that document, it was a blank document, and it was signed with the idea that it was peace and friendship, not a land cession, right? And so I think we think about the process in which we govern the treaty making. And it's also, we used to bring our whole town with us to those treaty negotiations, not just 4 or 5 people. In fact, there was a famous saying from a Cherokee. He said to the U.S. treaty negotiators, he said, "Where are the women?" And we had brought our whole town. We brought the kids, the women, everyone. They were part of that negotiation. It wasn't just 10 guys standing up there. And so I think we have to think of it differently as a community-wide event, not just some elite event. So it has to be witnessed and understood by a large amount of people. And then I think this is why I use treaties between Indigenous nations, because I think that highlights the best possible example. So I use the Buffalo Treaty, but there's also the Haltzik and Haida Treaty of 2015. There's other treaties, of course, between Indigenous nations that are all throughout. And those really highlight the processes that we would undertake for ourselves, that we would ask settler society to also undertake. So renewal would have to be built in, right? Those renewal processes. And I think of those as ceremony, but it's also a form of witnessing. Again, it's a form of recommitting to those ideals that you laid out. And it's a place to address those misunderstandings. If there are misunderstandings, if they're legitimate, you address them. And if there are some harms that have been caused by this treaty, you need to address them there at that point too, with the idea that we can walk away from that treaty if it's not being addressed properly, if it's not a legitimate way or body for addressing our concerns as Indigenous people. So just some ideas there. I think, at the end of the day, ideally it would be in an Indigenous language too. So I would love to see, what if, we held a new Cherokee treaty negotiation entirely in Cherokee. And so you have these non-Indigenous people struggling to understand what's being said, and it's translated by us into English, not by white people into Cherokee, right? And so I think that would be a beautiful thing too, is it would really reflect our worldviews, because our languages are so beautiful and so comprehensive. So just some ideas, but I think read up. I think Gina Starblanket and others are doing some really innovative work in this area.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Just one last question, which I think maybe speaks to the issue of the way forward. John Chatterton, would you like to pose your question?
Yes, thank you, Jeff. I'm speaking from the Wurundjeri land in here, and I was curious about the 4 points which were a dead end to reconciliation, and I was curious to understand whether there are key points which could be seen as the living beginning of reconciliation, and to some extent I think you've already just been touching on some of those points, and whether or not they're just not the opposite of the dead end, but something different. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, John. I think those dead ends, I used to say, similar to the youth, I used to say reconciliation is dead, just stop with it already. And I used even the language test as saying there's no word for reconciliation in Cherokee and, all that stuff. And then I realized we need to get a little bit more nuanced and say, this is why it's problematic, especially as it's been practiced. And so that's why I had those 4 dead ends as I see it. So yeah, I think to some degree, it's the stories that help us through. So all of our stories involve, when we tell them in Cherokee, you're all part of the story. So when I'm telling you about the plant nations, you're there at the council with me when I tell you in Cherokee, right? And so bringing people into the story in innovative ways, to me, is an important part of this, and what that might look like. That's what made our stories so beautiful, but also terrifying, right? We have some good Halloween stories that'll scare just about anyone. But those stories are living, and they're also always showing us a way through. And so when we go back to those stories, those stories, even how medicine came to the people, it doesn't just end with Cherokees, became sick and we all perished. There's a way through that's provided. And so I would say, using those stories as a basis for understanding our governance is an important aspect of this. And then I think, I like the colonial reality tours and things like that, but it also has to be accompanied with some action. And so the other thing that Cheryl did is she created a community tool shed. And so as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples coming together, we all converge on those parks and even private land at times, and we pull invasive species. And so if we collectively can start recognizing these invasive species, and I think of invasive species maybe in a broader sense, these invasive ideas, let's attack the mentalities, let's attack racism, let's pull these invasive ideas out of our communities and make a commitment, just like we're pulling these invasive plants out of our communities, so that the Indigenous plants can thrive, so that we can have a regeneration of Indigenous food systems and communities. And so, and again, I look to the artists. I think there's a lot of really amazing artists that like Carrie. That's why I'm so inspired by people like that bring people together with a common vision. He's done a lot of different artwork, but one of his recent ones was something called Earth Drums. And it's just 4 cedar drums that are in the middle of a park. And the idea is it's reconciliation with the earth, right? And and these drums actually pick up sounds, right? They pick up, so you're able to interact with it. So what are some ways that we could think about putting our presence back on the land, right? And so that reminds people that we're still here. And so Cherokee artist Jeff Marley started writing signs in Cherokee and in English saying we're still here, and then putting them in very prominent places, in parks, in public places, so that we're not erased. And I think those kinds of things really spark people's maybe memory, but also spark people's ideas around ways that we can, you know, that we still have a presence on this place, so we're not erased, so that we have a vibrant, not only presence, but we're able to be honored and respected.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff, for that. Also the wonderful metaphor about rooting out racism. I think it's extremely appropriate. I just want to thank you for your generosity of time, and just to welcome everybody to come to the session tomorrow. We're going to have a panel discussion tomorrow to continue some of these themes. And then next week, we've also got another 2 sessions. But thank you very much for everyone and to attend, and also for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't manage to get to all of them, but I'm sure we could sit here and talk for many more hours. So this is really just the start of a process. And thank you all for participating in it.
What of Vanessa, and to all of you, this is, I love the conversation, and let's keep the conversation going, not only this week, but beyond that. So absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.